to worship you. I live to worship you. I live to worship you. To worship, to worship, to worship you. I live to worship you. I live to worship you.
I want to continue with our talk about the foundations of our nation. And I think you're going to be a little surprised by some of what I share with you today, but I said to you last week that before I could really talk a lot about our role here today in America, it's not possible to do that until you really understand who we are as Americans and how we got here and what we're supposed to be. So I want to talk a little bit today about our founding documents. And if you'll just indulge me, I'm going to go through some things kind of quickly, but what I intend to do today is I want to marry our history with our contemporary occurrences. And so if you'll just indulge me a little bit. When our Constitution was written, debate over it began in the press after an anonymous writer in New York, in the New York Journal, warned citizens that the document was not all that it seemed to be. This form of government, I want you to listen carefully to the words here. And I want you to notice something else also. I've already said it, and I'll just point it out. An anonymous citizen. Anonymous was so important. This form of government is handed to you by the recommendations of a man who merits the confidence of the public. But you ought to recollect that the wisest and best of men may err, and their errors, if adopted, may be fatal to the community, said the author who took the pen name Cato to voice his displeasure with the parts of the constitutions that were championed by George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin. He later wrote this. He said, and his anonymous letter there, just I read a part of it, that sparked a conversation and a debate throughout the nation. And he later wrote this. He said, listen so carefully, please. Government, to an American, is the science of his political safety. This then is a moment, yes, the most important, and it points to your reputation as members of a great nation and to your immediate safety and to that of your posterity. In your private concerns and affairs of life, you deliberate with caution and you act with prudence. Your public concerns require a caution and a prudence in a ratio suited to the difference and dignity of the subject. The disposal of your reputation and your lives and property is more monumentous than a contract for a farm or the sale of baked goods. In the latter, it is a mere loss of a little property, which more circumspection may repair. In the former, if you neglect or are attentive, the ambitious and despotic will entrap you in their toils and bind you with a cord of power from which you and your posterity may never be freed. And it carries along with it the consequences that will make your community totter to its center. Now, those are powerful words, and those are words that are just as relevant today as they were when they were written in the 17 whatevers. And they were written in a state called New York by a guy who went by the name Cato. Now, Cato wouldn't be allowed to have a Facebook account today because the Gestapos at Facebook would not even think of allowing someone to be anonymous. We have to know who you are, and we have to track every single thing you say. Now you say, well, why are you picking on Facebook? Well, Facebook is kind of like the new newspapers. I mean, so many people go there for news and information. A lot of people never leave that site as far as where they go for information. But who was Cato? Because Cato shaped the debate in the nation to give us what we have today. I'm going to talk about what we have today a little bit. His real name, they ultimately found out, was George Clinton. Now, I know George Clinton doesn't ring a bell with too many of you, but at that time, he was the governor of the state of New York. And even then, he knew he had to write anonymously. Why? Because somebody else would have picked him off as the leader of this thing and arrested him, and you're the governor, but you're really a traitor, and gone after him that way, and he knew it. And so he had to put the thoughts out so that everybody would start talking. You're only as strong as the army behind you. Remember that. Now, today, in our nation, this is the very first crisis that we've ever had in history where we haven't counted the cost. Not even allowed to talk about the costs. Somehow, if you're not all about fear and spreading fear, you're evil and all you care about is money. But we live in a very real world. We live in a world full of trade-offs. We make decisions every single day. Scarcity and risk are always ruling our thoughts. Always. Counting the cost is always, always, always a factor. And today in this country, we have shuttered this nation, even the world, because of models put out by epidemiologists. And quite frankly, those models are not playing out. I have some videos here today.
What would have happened, for example, if we'd adopted a more conventional response to this epidemic? What if we'd asked the elderly and the immunocompromised and anyone else facing statistically higher rates of risk to stay inside, cloistered away? And then at the same time, allowed the rest of the population to use informed common sense and continue to work? What if we'd done that a month ago? Would the death rate today be much higher than it is now? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. But it's clearly a conversation we should have had before we locked the entire country down and put 10 million people out of work. But we didn't have that conversation. Instead, we outsourced the decision to public health officials. And that's the strange irony of the moment we're living through. One of the main lessons of this crisis is that the public health establishment failed us badly. The World Health Organization colluded with the Chinese government to lie about critically relevant facts during the early days of the outbreak. Once the coronavirus reached our shores, the CDC couldn't seem to produce working tests. Those were disasters. Many people died because the people we trusted to protect our health didn't do it. They've been thoroughly discredited. At the same time, though, we're being asked to trust these same people without hesitation, and for the most part, we are doing that. In other words, the experts failed, yet the experts now have more power than ever before. It's bewildering. In fact, it's reminiscent of 2008, when reckless behavior by the banks crippled the economy and crushed the middle class. But when it came time to fix it, we put bankers in charge of the cleanup. Now, this is not an argument against expertise. It's not even a populist argument. Of course, bankers understand finance. Epidemiologists understand coronavirus far more than most people do. So turning to experts in crisis makes sense, and we should, and hopefully we always will.
Let's look at the furor that Cato, aka Governor Clinton, caused in the United States. There were two groups of people, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and they had this big struggle going on. Alexander Hamilton and the other Federalists said that rights were simply understood and didn't need to be written down. But the Anti-Federalists, they weren't buying that. They knew better. They had just won a war over these very issues, and they wanted to make sure that it was all spelled out and written down. And the Anti-Federalists opposed the ratification of the Constitution because they feared that the new national government would be too powerful, and it would thus threaten individual liberties without the Bill of Rights. In fact, the opposition, causing the opposition, the Anti-Federalists said that excessive power of the national government would be at the expense of state governments. The disguised monarch powers of the president, they called it that. They said it's a president, but it's really he's disguised as a monarch, should he ever get too powerful. By the way, just pay attention to some of the things that are happening. They had great apprehensions about a federal court system. Now, I know we haven't talked about that a lot, but I can tell you this. If you get pulled up on a charge with the states or with the city, you got a good chance fighting it in court and get a good lawyer and see what happens. You get called up on a federal charge, I've never heard of anybody beating a federal case. I mean, one or two. Very, very few. They had a real concern about that. They had a fear that Congress might seize too many powers under the clause that said when it was necessary and proper. They had concerns that the Republican form of government couldn't work in a land the size of the United States. And back then, we just had the East Coast. The Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened, and out west, all the way to California, we didn't have that. And their most successful argument against the adoption of the Constitution was the lack of a Bill of Rights to protect the individual liberties. And listen to what Patrick Henry said. Listen to him. He said, God himself wouldn't want this power. The Constitution as it stands is a refuge of lies and an agreement with hell without the Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry. Video number 2, please.
We took drastic mitigation actions anyway, though, because experts warned us that millions and millions could die. Who would ever want to even tolerate the thought of that? But Stanford's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who thinks the models are off by many multiples. He spoke recently with Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution. Watch.
I'm a little bit astounded, maybe, unless you tell me I shouldn't be, that they've shut down the economy without knowing quite what they're doing.
People plug the worst case into their models. They project forward and say 2 to 4 million deaths. Newspapers pick up the 2 to 4 million deaths. Politicians have to respond. And the scientific basis for that projection is completely, there's no study underlying that scientific projection in the sense of that number, that denominator of that number doesn't exist.
So how do we get a more accurate denominator?
If you want to know in the population how many people have had it and recovered from it, you want to know the denominator, you have to have the antibody test. You need both in the denominator. And so with the antibody test, you can get the denominator for the population fatality rate, for anything at the population level. It's only in the last week and some that they become available.
Now, as awful as the 4,700 plus COVID deaths are in this country, and that's an awful number, we're only beginning to see the destruction caused, of course, by crashing our economy as well.
The universal quarantine, or essentially that's what we have, is incredibly costly. And people have characterized as costly to the economy, and you get accused of being crass because you're comparing dollars with people's lives, right?
Yes.
I mean, I'm actually kind of sympathetic to that, but actually, it's not just dollars to lives. It's lives to lives, right? A global economic collapse will cost lives of I believe, millions of people, and not just in the United States. I mean, worldwide.
You know, here's what's happening in the United States. Someone said emergency, and we're all good people. And we all said, okay, hey, what do you need? We'll help you. What's the problem? What do we need to do? Okay, you got it. You're fine. But now, several weeks, a month has gone by, and people go, well, wait a second. What's really going on here? And now other people, very learned people, like these gentlemen, are stepping up and going, you can't possibly know any of this. You don't have the factors that you need to make the decisions. What are you doing? This isn't what you say it is. And this is just the beginning of these people beginning to finally speak out. But in the meantime, it's absolutely clear to everybody that absolutely the only acceptable conversation that you can have is panic and fear. Anything else is simply not tolerable. All you care about is Wall Street, if that's who you are. And that's just not the reality of it. The reality of it is that panic and fear absolutely never, ever, ever works out. I was on an ambulance for a long time, and I can remember that you can have a tendency to panic in a really dire situation. We're in some of those situations. And I remember, I think I was 20, 21 years old at the time, and I remember getting a little excited one particular event, and my senior partner quickly recognized that and spoke, just calm down, just like that, very, very sternly, and snapped me right back. Because I noticed something, panic can grow, and that's what you're seeing, is panic is growing. Panic is absolutely never, never, never a good thing, period. Rational thought is always more important. Always better results. So I want to talk about the founding documents of our nation. I want to read something to you. I'm going to the Declaration of Independence, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to read two little parts out of it. And the first part is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now everybody can quote that. And some people can quote the next part of it. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But most people don't know that there's not a period there, there's a comma after that. And listen to what it says after that, because it's so important. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. That's right in our Declaration of Independence. That's in the first paragraph. That if anything ever goes wrong, get rid of these people and put in good people. Go to the next video, please.
And the Department of Homeland Security are doing, but this is not a major threat for the people in the United States, and this is not something that the citizens of the United States right now should be worried about.
It's not a major threat. So 2 days after he made the appearance you just saw, Chinese security forces quarantined an entire city of 11 million people. In some cases, they locked residents inside their homes from the outside. Some died there. Chinese authorities were clearly panicked by what was happening, but Anthony Fauci was not. He assured Americans that while they might want to reconsider immediate travel plans to Wuhan, going to the Super Bowl was absolutely fine. But fewer than 2 months ago, Anthony Fauci told us not to worry about this epidemic. Now he's demanding that the federal government quarantine the entire country.
Does it make sense to you that some states are still not issuing stay-at-home orders? I mean, whether there should be a federally mandated directive for that or not, that I guess that's more of a political question, but just scientifically, doesn't everybody have to be on the same page with this stuff?
Yeah, I think so, Anderson. I don't understand why that's not happening. As you said, you know, the tension between federally mandated versus states' rights to do what they want is something I don't want to get into. But if you look at what's going on in this country, I just don't understand why we're not doing that. We really should be.
A nationally, federally mandated shutdown. So how long would such a shutdown last? Well, just 2 days ago, Anthony Fauci suggested the country should remain under quarantine until there are no more coronavirus infections and no more deaths. He did not suggest when that might be, if ever. But politicians followed his lead anyway. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam has shuttered his state until June 10th. A source with knowledge reports tonight that Andrew Cuomo has privately discussed locking down the state of New York until possibly fall. Meanwhile, various epidemiologists are talking about putting the entire nation on a year of cycled shutdowns. That means Americans would be allowed back to work, then ordered home again, then back to work, over and over again. To be clear, these are extreme measures. We can only guess at the social and economic destruction they might wreak, but it would be profound, that's for sure. More than 10 million Americans have already lost their jobs. Imagine another year of this. That would be national suicide. And yet that's what Anthony Fauci is suggesting, at least. Now, we're not suggesting Fauci wants to hurt America. We don't think he does. He seems like a very decent man. But Fauci is not an economist, or for that matter, someone who fears being unemployed himself. Like most of the people around him, this is not an attack, just an observation. Fauci has bulletproof job security. He's not thinking that way. He has the luxury of looking at the world through the narrow lens of his profession. He doesn't seem to think much outside that lens. Watch this exchange from NBC's morning show yesterday.
I know it's difficult, but we're having a lot of suffering, a lot of death. This is inconvenient from an economic and a personal standpoint, but we just have to do it.
Inconvenient? 10 million Americans out of work and staring at poverty. That is not, quote, inconvenient, as you just heard Dr. Fauci put it. It's horrifying. In fact, it's a far bigger disaster than the virus itself, by any measure. Tony Fauci, decent as he may be, can't see that because he doesn't think it's his job to see it. But even a doctor should be able to think beyond the models. Our response to coronavirus could turn this into a far poorer nation. Poor countries are unhealthy countries, always and everywhere. In poor countries, people die of treatable diseases. In poor countries, people are far more vulnerable to obscure viruses like the one we're fighting now. You want to keep Americans from dying before their time? Then don't impoverish them. For all his credentials, his experience, his apparent personal decency, Dr. Anthony Fauci does not seem to understand any of this, and we should never let someone like that run this country.
I want to go back to the Declaration, because there's another little piece that people always don't pay attention to. I'll just quote this part. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is the right of the people, it is indeed their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. In other words, when the government begins to get out of control, you had better act and get rid of them, because they'll go further. Go to the next video, please, video 4.
But it's not only the Democrats playing games here. Former Trump administration FDA commissioner, well, he's actually seeing his own demand peak. Scott Gottlieb, he's on television several times a day and has the ear of the White House. He's written a kind of roadmap to recovery plan that discusses the need to do a bunch of things to get back to normal, including, in part, tracking citizens' movement during this crisis. Now, some of this is already happening. Sources told the Wall Street Journal that the federal, state, and local governments have already started collecting and studying geolocation data. Now, it turns out that big tech is helping Big Brother track your COVID compliance. Now, we expect this kind of stuff from China and Russia, maybe even Korea, but here? Now, when I was a student in the Soviet Union, they watched our every move. There were informants in our hotel and the coffee, stand-up little coffee shops, and they all received special government privileges for ratting out, tourists into the Soviet Union or even their fellow citizens. My goodness, we can't have that here. Now, in the coming days and the coming weeks, we're going to be doing some tracking of our own, of the models funded by billionaires that keep Americans out of work, and of projections that are based in faulty assumptions, and in some cases, even incomplete data. Congress may be out of session while you're out of work, but not us.
It gets even better. I have more to show you as we go on here. But for the moment, I want to turn to Ezekiel, chapter 46, please. Just want to read one verse. Ezekiel, chapter 46. Moreover, the prince shall not take of the people's inheritance by oppression, to thrust them out of their possession, that means property, but he shall give his son's inheritance out of his own possession, that my people be not scattered, every man from his possession. It is God's intention that the king doesn't take our possessions, our property. And our property is more than just our home. It's our livelihood, it's our personal possessions, it is all kinds of things, our property. So now, as we continue going back to our founding fathers, one of my favorite people is Patrick Henry. And I'm going to take a few minutes and share a little bit of that speech with you that he gave, that such famous one. It was given in March 23rd, 1775 at St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, at the Virginia Convention. And the main purpose of his speech was to convince the delegates to secede from Britain, and moreover, to actually fight back against them. And on that day that he gave his very famous speech, he was arguing that the Virginia military should be involved in actually fighting a war against the British to get them out of the United States. He wanted to convince the people attending that the Virginia troops should be waging war with Great Britain. Now, understand what was happening. At that time, Britain had sent warships all over the harbors, okay? So I'm going to just recite a little bit of this, and there was a couple of people who gave observations at that time, and I've read their observations, and I'll share some of that in it. I won't read the whole speech, but a couple parts are important. And I want you to hear the language, because remember, our heritage is important. The only reason we're sitting here today is because of men like this. He said, "No man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as the abilities of every worthy gentleman who's just addressed this house. But different men often see the same subject in different lights, and therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if I, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs. I speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. And in proportion to that magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and country. Should I keep back my opinion at such a time through fear of giving offense? I should consider myself as guilty of treason toward my country and of an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven if I were to do so. And I revere him above all earthly kings." That was a word he sent to the king. "Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, the things which are so clearly concerning our temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I'm willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how gracious a reception our petition comports with the warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are the fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Remember, there were loyalists in the Virginia House, and there were people who didn't think we should stay loyal to the king. And there were representatives of the king all there. And he was speaking directly to them. Let us not deceive ourselves. These are the implements of war and subjugation, and the last arguments, which are the last arguments to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, sir, that this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission, what other cause can there be? Can gentlemen assign any other motive for it? They are meant for us, and they are meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon those the chains from which the British ministry have been forging for so long. And I want to pause for a second, because there is a group here that has been forging chains for a long time, that have desired to take over our nation. And pay attention, because these words are as important today as they were in 1776. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious objective of our contest shall be obtained, then we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to the arms and to the God of hosts in all that is left in us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be in the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard has stationed in every house? Shall we gather by irresolution and inaction? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying flat on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies have bound us hand and feet? We are not weak. If we make proper use of those means which God of nature has placed in our power, the millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty and in such a country as that which we possess are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who will rise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, to the active, and to the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. Then he turns to the loyalists and he says, there is no retreat but submission to slavery. Our chains are forged. He picked up his hands, looked over to the colonists. Our chains are forged. Their clanking can be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why do we stand here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? God forbid it. Almighty God forbid it. For I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And then he took a letter opener and he feigned stabbing himself in the chest and falling down. Now we all know that speech, but what caused him to become that convinced that tyranny was so bad? Patrick Henry was a lawyer. What caused him to do that? He was walking into the courthouse one day and he saw someone in stocks. Oh, just because he saw someone in the stocks, you know, the stockade thing there, the stocks. That's what drove him? What was this criminal guilty of? He was a preacher. He was guilty of preaching the gospel. He died. Patrick Henry realized what this all meant and what was at stake. And that's how he became Patrick Henry, that we know about. Turn to Psalms, chapter 59. I just want to read one verse there. Our freedoms are so important, and they were so hard fought to have today. And we have no business rolling over and just giving them away. And we won't get them back, I'm telling you that now. Psalm 59, verse 2, deliver me from the workers of iniquity and save me from bloody men. I'll let you figure out what all that means. Let's go to video number 5, please.
Observed recurring violations of the Safer at Home order, please continue to let us know at coronavirus.lacity.org/business violation. You know the old expression about snitches? Well, in this case, snitches get rewards. We want to thank you for turning folks in and making sure we are all safe.
I have a question, Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles. Who keeps us safe from you?
I talked last week about how so many people think that the Supreme Court is the ultimate authority in the nation, and if you're here last week, we talked about how it isn't. But I want to look at Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, and I want to read just a little bit of it, and I'll explain it, because this is a clause that most people are totally unaware of. And what it does is it gives it lays out the authority of the courts, okay? And there's quite a bit here, and then it says this: in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. And there were a few other things that listed before that. And so I want to explain this concept for a second, original jurisdiction. That means that if there's an issue affecting an ambassador, or an issue affecting one state to another, and an issue where a person has a problem with a state, or a state with a person, and there's a few other variations of all that, and a few other things. In those cases, the place to go for remedies is the Supreme Court. You don't go to your local city court for that, period. And so it says that's the original jurisdiction of the court. Now, in all other cases before mentioned, in all the other cases before the mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such, all right, so I'll explain that. So in other words, the other jurisdiction that the court has is to be appealed to, so they can hear about the law and the facts and decide if the law is in fact a good law or not. That's it. So that's what that says. So it says they've got some original jurisdiction, but everything else is an appellate thing. And they can actually hear the facts of the case and even decide on the law of the case. And frequently, that's just about all that the court does, is they decide on the law of the case. And that's its appellate jurisdiction. Now watch this. In all of the cases before the mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. Congress actually has the authority in the Constitution to limit the Supreme Court. And they can say, court, you may not hear this case. Now that's very important, because see, somehow today we think that the Supreme Court is the absolute final authority and no one can question them. And these are 9 gods who deliver stone tablets to us. That's not the case. Congress can pass legislation to limit the court's power by changing the court's jurisdiction and by modifying the impact of a court decision after it's been made. Now, they can do that by actually kind of changing laws. So the court makes a decision and they say, how can we work around that? And they change the law a bit. Or by amending the Constitution in relation to the court. The president and the states may choose to even ignore or evade a court decision. And that's not very common, but this approach has been used in the past following many unpopular decisions. In a case called Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court ruled that whites could not enter Native American tribal lands without the tribe's permission. White Georgians, however, refused to abide by the court's decision. President Andrew Jackson, a former military leader in campaigns against the Native Americans, refused to ignore it. Between 1831 and 1838, members of several southern tribes, including the Cherokees, were forced by the U.S. Army to move west. The president's challenge to the court's legitimacy in this case led to its ruling being completely disregarded. So the Supreme Court is not the final authority in the nation. In the United States, this is called jurisdiction stripping or court stripping. And it is the limiting or reducing of a court's jurisdiction by Congress through its constitutional authority to determine the jurisdiction of federal and state courts. Congress cannot strip the Supreme Court of jurisdiction over those cases from original jurisdiction, but it can limit the appellate jurisdiction of the court. And I don't want to read all of this here, but there have been several cases, and I just want you to, just a couple quick cases here and we'll close up. During Reconstruction, Congress withdrew jurisdiction from a case that the U.S. Supreme Court was then in the process of adjudicating. In terminating the case, the justices acknowledged the authority of Congress to intervene. Listen to what they said. So the Supreme Court was actually in the middle of hearing a case, and Congress stepped in and said, knock it off, guys, get that case off your docket. And the Supreme Court acknowledged, listen to what they said, we are not at liberty to inquire into the motives of the legislature. We can only examine it into its power under the Constitution. And the power to make exceptions to the appellate jurisdiction of this court is given by express words. It is quite clear, therefore, that this court cannot proceed to pronounce judgment in this case, for it has no longer jurisdiction of the appeal. And the judicial duty is not less fitly performed by declining ungranted jurisdiction than in exercising firmly that which the Constitution and the law confers. In 1882, the Supreme Court again concluded that its own actual jurisdiction is confined within the limits of Congress sees fit to prescribe. In 1948, the Supreme Court in Felix Frankfurter case conceded that in a dissenting opinion that Congress need not give this court any appellate power. It may withdraw appellate jurisdiction once conferred. And I can go on and on. There's a whole bunch of cases, including recently, including in, I won't tell you all of them, but in 1996, there were 2 of them, 3 of them in 2005 and 2006. In fact, Congress does know about the power because there have been hundreds of unsuccessful bills in Congress to strip the courts of jurisdiction in certain cases. Let's go to video number 6, please.
What about our civil liberties? We're going to get our freedom back when this is all over, right?
This is going to be transformative. We're never going to be the same again. The fear that we have, the anxiety that we have, that's not just going to go away. When do we get back to normal? I don't think we get back to normal. I think we get back, or we get to a new normal.
Wait. And what new normal is that? The old normal was when your kids actually went to school. You could go to work, you could go to church if you wanted, and maybe a restaurant or watch a sporting event or play sports with your friends. You traveled anywhere and whenever you damn well please, without government tracking or police questioning you. That was the old normal. So if the new normal means something innocuous, like we won't buy drugs from China, well, that's great. That's a good new normal. And if it means that we stay home when we're sick and we wash our hands more, fantastic. We all want that. But if the new normal that Cuomo's talking about means abandoning the life we loved before the coronavirus, or using this crisis, as some seem to be doing, as a vehicle for advancing a left-wing freedom-killing agenda, well, count us out.
Let's go to the next video, where this is the governor of California, Comrade Gavin Newsom. Now let's see what Gavin Newsom's ideas are.
Absolutely, we see this as an opportunity to reshape the way we do business and how we govern. And that shouldn't put shivers up the spines of, one party or the other. I think it's an opportunity anew for both parties to come together and meet this moment and really start to think more systemically, not situationally, not just about getting out of this moment, but more sustainably and systemically to consider where we can go together this historic moment if we meet it at a national level and a state and subnational level. So answer is yes.
Yeah, he wants to change everything. He wants to get his radical agendas all up there, running, functioning, keeping everybody under control, making this place a socialist nation. That's what he wants to do. They're trying to seize this opportunity. And that's why our founding fathers saw that we would have a limited federal government. That was their whole purpose. And this federal monstrosity that has grown and grown and grown and grown would appall our founding fathers. It was interesting. I heard something. I didn't bother to put the clip on there, but some states have mandated that essential services are abortion clinics. but all the gun shops have to close. I just thought that was very interesting. Very, very interesting. It just shows where we've gone. But I look back to Alexander Hamilton. What did Alexander Hamilton say? And he was one of the Federalists. He believed in a federal government. But what did he say? The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms. Period. Pay attention to what's going on. I want to close with Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 18. Jeremiah chapter 18, we're going to start in verse 7. At what instant shall I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck up and to pull down and to destroy it? If that nation against whom I have pronounced turn from their evil, I will repent of the evil that I thought to do unto them. I don't want to be in a position where God is thinking to do evil to us. There is no appeal to his decisions. And at what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to build and to plant it. And if it do evil in my sight, that it obey not my voice, then I will repent of the good wherein I said I would benefit them. Now therefore go to speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I frame evil against you, and devise a device against you. Return you now, everyone, from his evil way, and make your ways and your doings good. And they said, There's no hope, but we will walk after our own devices, and we will every one do the imagination of his evil heart. I just pray that's not where our nation lands. And I believe that there are churches who understand that the reason that we have the president we have, the reason we've had the opportunities we've had, the reason we're not in an even deeper mess at this moment, is because the people who are called by his name have humbled themselves and prayed. And I believe this is a call to deeper prayer and to more people to do that and to join that. And I absolutely believe that if we keep in mind our Christian responsibilities and our citizen responsibilities, we can come out of this stronger. We have to pay attention to what's going on, though, and understand that we absolutely will be victorious. Amen?